Good evening. My name is Mark Dunley, and I'm co-chair of the EcoAction Committee of the Green Party of the United States. We try about monthly to do a webinar to educate ourselves and then our members and then other concerned individuals about various issues related to the environment. Been a lot of focus on the climate. This evening, we're going to do real zero carbon emissions versus net zero. The difference means everything. Before we just start that, I'll mention that many of you already are members of the Green Party. You don't have to be, but we'd like you to be. And if you would like to sign up to receive updates from the party about the work we're doing, not only on the environment and the climate, but on racial justice and peace and other concerns, you can go to gp.org and there'll be a link there to sign up for updates. Believe it or not, at the end of the year is a great time to make a contribution to help keep our staff funded and pay for all the good things that needed for a party. So you got about 2 weeks now to make it into the year thing. And we also hope you consider becoming a monthly sustainer to help with our expenses. So we decided to focus on the issue of real zero carbon emissions versus net zero, because net zero has recently become sort of the mantra of, we would say, a lot of the polluters and particularly politicians that are trying to avoid making hard decisions. Corporate greenwashing is very easy for companies and countries to say, sure, we're going to get to net zero. Without really having a commitment to go to, absolute zero. And that often the net part of it means that they're going to continue to burn fossil fuels in various places. Those various places invariably tend to be low-income communities and communities of color, and that many of the carbon offsets that have been used over the last 15, 20 years, in fact, have not at all delivered the type of carbon reductions that are needed. The Green Party has, supported 100% renewable energy, zero emissions by 2030. We kicked off the Green New Deal, back in 2012. So we put together this forum to talk about it. We'll do the first half hour or so of presentations by David Schwartzman and then Mike Ewall. And then at that point, we'll open the rest of the last half hour up for questions and answers. I'll go in a little bit more into Mike's background when he is about to speak, but just will mention that Mike Ewall is the founder and director of Energy Justice Network, which is a national network supporting grassroots resistance against dirty energy and waste facilities. I'll mention that Mike has been actually quite active up here in the Capital District of New York, helping us in some fights down in Albany County about some various waste facilities and cement plants. But our first speaker is David Schwartzman. David is a member of the DC Statehood Green Party. He's a professor emeritus of biology at Howard University and the author of Life, Temperature, and the Earth. David and his older son, Peter, who is the mayor of Galesburg, Illinois, as a member of the Green Party of Illinois, just had their paper published. Can the 1.5 degree centigrade warming target be met in the global transition to 100% renewable energy? Their book website is theearthisnotforsale.org. And David was quite vocal in pushing the International Green Party coalition to support the concept of real zero as part of our effort going into the COP26, the Global Greens COP26 network. So, David, take it away.
Yes, I'm really happy to be on this panel, and I'm honored to share this with Mike Ewall because of his great leadership in the struggle for environmental justice. And I urge people to consider not only donating to the Green Party, but also to the Energy Justice Network, which I intend to do. So I will, I have 12 minutes. I'm going to be concise. And let's see. So I'm going to, where is the arrow? That's the problem. To change my slide, I can't find. Wait a second.
On your keyboard, you might want to do the right key at the bottom below the shift.
Which one is it? Because, you know, I usually hit the N.
Hit the lower arrow.
The lower arrow. Okay.
Below the shift key.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm doing. And it's not shifting. Oh, dear. You know, we tried it before. Here we go. So I'm going to start with the COP26, which was pretty depressing, the results. And I'm going to share this PDF, this PowerPoint as a PDF for anyone who wants it. I'm not going to cover everything, of course, in 12 minutes. So big emissions cuts were needed, and to keep warming to the 1.5 degrees centigrade limit, and with the pledges were far from what's required for 2030. The UN Secretary General said, our fragile planet is hanging by a thread. We're still knocking on the door of climate catastrophe. That is a bit of an understatement. It is time to go in emergency mode, or our chance of reaching net zero will itself be zero. Now, again, the official goal is net zero, both of the UN and national governments, including the US. And that's what we're critiquing. The world is on track for at least warming of 2.4 degrees. And I gave sources to all these statements. So if you get the PDF, you will be able to check out the sources. Now, the Green Party, I'm proud to say, made a very strong statement that this is going to lead to climate catastrophe and rejecting false solutions, and called for a global Green New Deal. Now, here is a pretty concise explanation of what net zero is about. So this guy who's still drinking alcohol and beer and is committed to get off, basically says he'll quit drinking by 2050. And it's not important to switch, to rush it, you know, to non-alcoholic beverages. And And he also says, I have drinking credits for the last 40 years for all the time I didn't drink. And finally, he has a second beer refrigerator for capture and storage. So this puts, which I found on Facebook, by the way, Ian Angus shared this. So as we already mentioned, the Global Greens COP26 demands, which our party participated in, which Mark and I and others were involved with, these Zooms did, and we pushed for real zero. And there was resistance at first, but it was incorporated in the demands. And with other, as you see, other very welcome language. Of course, the devil's in the details. So here is a very useful summary of how net zero targets disguise climate inaction. They don't mean zero emissions, obviously. There's not enough land on the planet to accommodate all the combined corporate and government, quote, net zero plans for offsets and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage from tree plantations. And collectively, net zero allows for continuing rising levels of greenhouse gas while hoping the technologies will suck them up. Here is some useful other critiques of net zero, which again you can get by emailing me, and I can share the whole PowerPoint with you. So here are some examples of how net zero is being implemented now. For example, Japan is already committed to going to blue hydrogen as an answer to coal. Blue hydrogen. Well, green hydrogen is better than blue hydrogen. Green hydrogen is basically using renewable energy to electrolyze water to produce hydrogen. It's sort of a waste of energy, in my opinion, but blue hydrogen is getting hydrogen by chemical reaction with natural gas, using, for instance, coal to generate the energy, and then coupling this with carbon capture and storage. And Shell Oil Company has already a worked out plan for blue hydrogen. However, two leading climate scientists, Bob Haworth and Mark Jacobson, have critiqued this blue hydrogen proposal and saying it's very difficult to justify from climate grounds. That is, the greenhouse gas emissions are probably going to be worse than with the blue hydrogen, rather, of course, than getting off fossil fuels totally, which is a real zero. Indonesia, here's Indonesia's plan for net zero. Deforestation, growing crops for biodiesel. And then we have our own net zero problems in the Build Back Better legislation, which would give tax breaks for carbon capture and carbon removal, yielding big payoffs for wiping out, for instance, companies' income tax bills. Again, non-accountable promises which continue the burning of fossil fuel and delaying their curbing or reduction to zero. So the real zero is really the only potential path to meet the 1.5 degree warming target and in a progressively unfolding eco-socialist Green New Deal, and which would build the capacity of the transnational working class and its allies to undermine the imperial agenda of the military-industrial complex, defeat fossil capital and its political instruments, all the while challenging, quote, green capital by building a global regulatory regime for environmental worker and community protection. And this is a path we have argued for a post-extractivist future with social management of production and consumption. Now, as Mark mentioned, we have a paper which was very recently published in Ames Energy Journal, and you can download it full text. And we modeled a real zero transition lasting 20 years, completely terminating coal and natural gas in 10 and conventional oil in 20, and generating sufficient wind and solar supply, assuming present technologies, which will only get better, to end energy poverty in the global south and have the capacity for climate mitigation and adaptation. Now, this at the same time, the world really needs to have address natural ecosystem restoration and shift to agroecology's regenerative agriculture. But those measures will be likely limited because of the additional warming. And so the capacity of the soil carbon pool will probably saturate and because of the additional warming. So we argue we need direct air capture of carbon dioxide and permanent storage in the crust by chemical reaction with the crust. I'm almost done. And here are some big problems in Biden's climate policies, which I think, of course, the Green Party has already laid out. And not only the commitment to net zero, but also nuclear power, natural gas consumption and fracking, and probably one of the biggest obstacles is the regime change agenda and the big military budget, which we're committed to challenge. I'm going to skip over this slide. And so I would argue that the biggest political challenge we have, not only in the US, but globally, is to defeat fossil capital and its political instruments. Now, I do have a slide here about climate and COVID denialism, which are paired together. And I think I've run out of time, Mark, so I'm going to maybe address this in the question period. Is that correct? My time is up. Is that correct?
You have 10 seconds.
Okay, good. I finished on time. The big capitalist powers of the global north have profound neglect of the global south, refusing to pay climate reparations and practicing what Howie Hawkins called global vaccine apartheid. So I'll conclude with that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. What we're going to do next is hear from Mike Ewall, and then we'll take questions after Mike has done his presentation. Mike is the founder and director of the Energy Justice Network, a national network supporting grassroots resistance against dirty energy and waste facilities, notably biomass and waste incinerators, coal and natural gas facilities. He is a longtime leader in exposing false solutions and policy loopholes that harm communities, especially exposing, especially impacting upon environmental justice community. He is co-author of Hoodwinked in the Hothouse, which exposes false climate solutions. And I just found this out today. He's a former member of our EcoAction committee and also a member of the platform, was a member of the platform committee of the Green Party of the United States. Over to you, Mike.
Okay. So thank you so much, Mark, and good to share a stage with David as well. Appreciate his deep expertise on all of this. So I'm going to get my PowerPoint rolling and see how much we can go through. Let's see. Okay. Does that look right? Okay, I'm going to assume so. All right. So here we go. All right. So when I think about net zero by 2050, which is often how things are being framed, and we see politicians still, after so many years, talking in those terms, it's basically just one of many varieties of perpetuating the status quo. The intent is purportedly good, and a lot of times it is good, but it carries the Trojan horses of many policy false solutions and technology false solutions. And so I want to outline some of those. This is a bit of an overview right here. I won't get time to critique all of these in detail, but I hope we'll get into any Q&A if people see any of these and thought, well, I thought coal could be clean. No, I don't expect that in this audience. But some might think biofuels are appropriate in certain places, or biomass, or that fossil fuel, like carbon taxes, are a good path forward, and we've been strongly critiquing that for well over a decade. So let me just see. The slides I have queued up are mostly critiquing carbon taxes, so I might breeze through some of them and just see what we can revisit in Q&A. But first, let's talk about offsets for a second. One of my favorite quotes about this is that offsets are an imaginary commodity created by deducting what you hope happens from what you guess would have happened. Now, Wall Street and all kinds of economic firms are lined up expecting a carbon trading economy, an offsets economy that is not like trading in apples that you can weigh and measure. You're trading in what consultants have been hired to say, well, we had a right to keep polluting for 50 more years, but since we're going to shut down early, or maybe even because the law forced us to shut down, but we're still going to sell credits as if we were able to keep going, we're going to sell that to someone else so that they can keep polluting a different community. And whether that's being done with greenhouse gas pollutants or with other pollutants is still very problematic, because the harm is still happening. And you're basically just creating one scenario versus another that are not easily measured in the first place. And even if they were precisely measured, you're still not reducing things when you basically say, well, you can trade the right around and you're just relocating the damage instead of stopping the damage. There was a 2016 report that found that 85% of offsets had a low likelihood of actually creating real impacts. And it's powerful when you see these, because a lot of the programs in Europe and the US, when they analyze them, they find, oh, well, we set the baseline really high at the beginning, and we had all these loopholes and these offsets. And by the time you add it all up, you realize that these policies that sounded good are really just doing a lot of damage, but not really solving the problem. One of the examples from my home state of Pennsylvania, we have most of the waste coal burning power plants in the country. Waste coal is something that makes normal coal look clean. It's dirtier than coal for the climate and mercury and toxic pollutants. And they are so in bed with this industry in Pennsylvania that the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which a lot of New England states and some of the Atlantic states now have going on, will not actually put a cost on those facilities. It's actually going to subsidize them to keep them open. And the fact that nuclear power is indirectly subsidized by making their competitors more costly. You just have a lot of false solutions, including ones that are worse than coal, like burning trash and biomass, that are worse than coal for the climate by far, but get a free pass in a lot of these policies. Now, carbon taxes are something that a lot of folks have jumped on the bandwagon to support. But what they do, basically, you have three different categories I would put energy in. You have the fossil fuels, then you have other sources of dirty energy, which includes nuclear power, biomass and waste incineration, biofuels. And then you have the ones that we would consider clean, even though some of them have issues as well, like wind, solar, hydro. Not a fan of new hydro or even keeping the existing ones. So same thing with geothermal, a lot of serious impacts with some of those. But the dividing line we mainly make is if you have to keep consuming fuels, if you have to burn something to create each megawatt hour, then that is inherently dirty. If there's combustion involved or nuclear involved, inherently dirty, because you have a whole extraction and waste system going on to perpetuate. So when you punish just part of the dirty sector, the fossil fuels, you're elevating the other false solutions that are also in the dirty sectors. Some of which are still fossil fuels, like the plastics in trash incinerators. They're basically oil, but that gets ignored, and they get to be put in a competitive advantage. These policies also ignore other pollutants and their impacts. So by looking just at carbon, what we call carbon fundamentalism, you ignore the fact that a lot of other toxic pollutants come out. And so you can't just trade these things around without basically saying that certain communities are going to get extra damage or continued damage by other pollutants that harm health much more directly in terms of asthma and cancer, or other health pollutants, birth defects, learning disabilities, and all sorts of things. So we don't want to be trading pollution around just because one of the pollutants, the carbon emissions, are a global pollutant, even though other ones are more locally impacting people. So one of the things that we really need to do is we need to directly unsubsidize the dirty energy industries. And I would include in that the fact that we have such a huge military budget with it, which is largely a fossil fuel subsidy in the form of making sure we secure cheap oil from around the world. Sometimes our wars are now for natural gas, like Afghanistan, or for uranium, like some of the adventures we got into in Africa under Obama. And rather than trading around and trying to tax emissions, which could be part of a solution, but needs a lot more involved, we need to at least first take the foot off the neck of the victim. Stop putting money into perpetuating the damage directly, and then let's see how we can phase things out and move in a good direction. Not expect market-based solutions to be adequate. Now, let's see. It's hard for me to see all my slides with this top bar here, but you have sectors that don't even get covered in our climate policies. You have animal agriculture, which, depending on which studies you believe, are somewhere between 18 and 51% of global greenhouse gases. Some will argue the 51% is not accurate or credible. That's fine. Even if it's 18, it's worse than the whole global transportation sector. So if we don't have policies that address the need to get rid of animal agriculture, then we're not addressing the climate crisis. And that's a hard topic to cover because people don't want to be told what to eat, but we can stop subsidizing these industries at a minimum, which will help shift things and show the true cost of meat and dairy consumption. We also see a lot of these policies excluding the waste sector, which by EPA's account, the materials economy is 42% of US greenhouse gas emissions. And yet that often just gets ignored when we're looking at just transportation and power plants. Now, studies of individual change that can be done to address the climate, which I don't advocate. I do advocate, but as a much lower priority than institutional change. We need to primarily be focusing on changing institutions. But one of the things that we fail to talk about, another topic that is one that you're not supposed to touch, is population. And everyone would be right to first say, well, we can't just talk about being a number of people. That's racist and has all these historic connotations, and that's true. However, it's population times consumption. It's the people in countries like the US that are over consuming to a huge degree, that any additional person living in the lifestyle in this country is doing an incredible amount of damage. And that consumption itself, which is the problem, it just outweighs so many other things that individuals can change their behavior on. There's a study that the most effective climate actions, the individual ones, the ones that involve not having kids or having fewer kids or changing your diet, are the ones that they don't talk about in school textbooks on this topic. So there's a need to be honest and talk about these tough issues as well as focusing on fossil fuels and such. For those of you who haven't seen Cowspiracy, a little plug for that on the environmental impacts of the animal ag issues. I'm going to skip over some of this here. So when I last analyzed the EPA data on how much greenhouse gas pollution is coming out of different energy generating sources, we found with EPA's own data, when they're not cooking their books, when you use the raw data of what's actually literally coming out of the smokestack, We find trash incineration is 2.5 times as bad as coal. Burning trees or other biomass about 50% worse than coal. So we need to stop ignoring these in our climate policies. I'm going to skip some of these because we're going to run out of time. Let's see. All right. So we talk about climate denial a lot of the time, and I would point the finger at the federal EPA under Obama's last year and point out that even the supposedly good policies that are trying to regulate oil and gas, or in one case, the landfill gas rule came out around the same time. In their footnotes, you'll notice that they deliberately use outdated science, a global warming potential where methane in both of these rules is assumed to be only 25 times as bad as CO2, when in fact we know it's about 82 times worse now. It was 86 times worse according to the data that was out from IPCC when these rules came out. And they deliberately are using outdated science, looking at it over 100 years instead of 20, and even then using lower numbers from previous studies just to stay consistent with certain databases that they had. So I have some more things on here about the weakness of carbon taxes, but let's skip over some of that and talk about solutions real quick. Actually, no, one more thing, no problem. The carbon Citizens Climate Lobby has a carbon fee and dividend bill they've been pushing by Senator Van Hollen. And it has a couple good things in there. But a lot of the things, they exempt animal agriculture outright. They exempt the military outright. They set baselines that are too high. These policies, they even give dividend checks back to only legal U.S. citizens, which means that or not citizens, residents. So some immigrants do qualify, but you're discriminating against millions of people who are not going to qualify for getting dividend checks, even though they're going to pay the higher taxes. So you have a racist wedge that they can drive into the movement if critics recognize this, and I'm sure the companies that fight this will. And finally, let's talk about the solutions real quick. What we need to do is we need to focus on conservation efficiency. We need to cut our demand by about 3/4 if we're getting serious about this and if we care about global parity. We need to have a clean energy portfolio standard at the national level, not the ones that they use the word clean and mean nuclear, or renewable and they mean burning trash and trees, but a really clean one that basically directs the industry to shift to clean energy sources within a certain time frame and not include all the combustion and other false solutions that are always in these bills at the state and federal level. We need to end the subsidies to dirty energy. And we need to make sure we have zero waste and sustainable agriculture policies that are in tandem with these, because we can't just put a price on carbon and expect that they're magically going to fix the fact that the transportation bill is 80% highways and real solutions are a fraction of that. And to get any of this, we need to have clean elections, because we can't get anything good at the federal level passed in most states, not at the state level, until we clean up our politics. So I'll leave it there and look forward to Q&A.
Well, thank you, Michael. Going to have to give a few little disclaimers here. We had also talked about doing a separate webinar on the issue of carbon taxes, and maybe we need to go back and do that. Technically, the Green Party nationally does support carbon taxes. It opposes cap and trade. And one of the things I would point out is when that leftist think tank, the International Monetary Fund, says that there's $5.3 trillion worth of annual subsidies in fossil fuels, they're almost overwhelmingly talking about the fact that we do not make polluters pay for the damage they cause by burning fossil fuels. Actually, the amount of direct subsidies of fossil fuels is quite a bit less. So unfortunately, if you don't do a carbon tax, you're allowing that $5 trillion worth of subsidies. And obviously, Mike may have a little disagreement on that. The one point we would agree with Mike is that, yes, there are lots of loopholes that are really bad. You always got to worry about the devil in the details. One of the things we've been fighting in New York is that one of the proposals for carbon pricing put forth by the independent system operators did try to exclude, or the garbage waste burning industry is trying to get excluded from that, but that it's not a proposal yet in New York State. So there's a lot of details on that. And one thing I would also make clear is that we definitely understand that a carbon tax in and of itself is not going to solve the climate crisis. So the carbon tax should be one of many of the other type of solutions that Michael has taken, not that you only do a carbon tax and forget, other solutions, particularly the need to mandate emissions. But this was not the forum on the carbon tax. This is about net zero. We did have a question posed, and I'll briefly answer it, but then I'll have our two experts answer it. Can you more clearly define what you mean by net zero? And I'll just give an example. In the new climate law that we passed in New York State, much weaker than the law that the Green Party proposed and supported, but they have set a goal of what they call net zero emissions by 2050. And what they define that to mean is only an 85% reduction in existing or 1990 greenhouse gas emissions. And so that would allow a continued 15%, which would somehow have to be offset. We don't mind offset when it's like regenerative agriculture or keeping existing forests. Building new forests is another type of problem, or wetland restoration. David Schwartzman probably will talk a little bit about direct air capture, but we do not like carbon offsets, and the idea that we're going to allow polluting facilities to continue in low-income in EJ communities while we allegedly go plant some trees in Brazil or Spain doesn't make any sense. So, gentlemen, can we give a quick definition? What is this? What is the definition of net zero?
Dave, you want to take that, or should I?
No, Mike, go ahead.
So when you say zero, it means zero. But when you say net zero, you're basically saying that you're going to trade things. You're going to use offsets. So you're not really going to reduce your emissions, definitely not to zero. You're going to buy the right to pollute from someone else that is supposedly reducing emissions. And in some cases, they're actually increasing emissions or not reducing as much as they claim. But they can manage to sell the right to you to continue doing harm, which ultimately doesn't help anyone.
Yeah, let me just add to that. One of the problems, the claim for the proponents of net zero is that the emissions will be balanced by the source going to the atmosphere, will be balanced by taking out carbon from the atmosphere in equal amounts. Of course, we know that from what you've already shown, Mike, and so on, and others, this is very problematic. It's promises, and it's unaccountable, and so forth. And it's also important to point out that it's not only net zero carbon emissions, we're also talking about anthropogenic emissions of other greenhouse gases, as you pointed out, Mike, from animal agriculture, methane. And you made a good point about methane, that EPA is using old data. Well, this was part of our critique in our paper in Ames Energy, that the previous studies of renewable transitions use the old data. We use Robert Howarth's research, which, of course, I know Mark knows a lot about Robert Howarth. He put out a research that showed that the greenhouse gas footprint of methane is actually worse than coal, okay? Because of the leakage of methane from the wellhead to the consumption. And for the reason that you mentioned, Mike, the big greenhouse gas impact of methane into the atmosphere.
I'm just going to add on methane short term, say in a 20-year period, has 80 times greater negative impact upon climate than carbon. And so when people do talk about greenhouse gas emissions, you sort of got to weight it. One point that Mike raised was and we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, that goes beyond carbon, but there are other pollutants that are very negative towards the environment and to humans as well. One of the interesting things about what's called the CCIA polluter penalty bill in New York State, besides going the traditional, they call it polluter penalty, really a carbon tax, they actually go after what's called the Title V permits as well. And so there are various contaminants that are unfortunately allowed to occur, like nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide and others. They actually go smaller tax, but they actually go after those as well in the CCIA bill. Now, one of the questions being posed is, we're all too much policy wonks here. And, what are the direct things that people need to be doing right now in the fight against net zero versus real zero? Before I'll just say, always the biggest thing is to stop any new fossil fuel infrastructure, period. No more gas pipelines, no more, fossil fuel plants being built, no allowing these companies go around the planet and buy up mothballed coal plants in order to run their proof of work Bitcoin currency operations. And one piece of good news today in New York, it's always the politicians weakened the bill before it was passed. I haven't seen the details, but largely New York City today said no to any more new gas hookups in New York City. And that's like the first real big, city to do that. And in fact, allowing people for free, like we do in New York, to hook up if you've done 100 feet of existing gas pipeline without having to pay a hookup fee, basically is saving them $20,000 and is putting that $20,000 into the rate base. And we talk a lot about electricity. Electricity is actually the easiest way to get to 100% renewable energy. But in New York State, it differs from state to state. But New York State, electricity now accounts for maybe 20% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And it's really buildings and transportation, which are the two biggers. But gentlemen, specific ideas, people right now, today, can get on the phone, write their legislative. What are some concrete ways to do this net zero, real zero fight?
Well, let me be very brief. And this is something going on in my community, DC. There is a determined effort to go, which is called Beyond Gas. Natural gas is leaking right out of the streets in DC, like many urban areas, because of the pipes that are corroded and so forth. And so we are pushing for a rapid replacement of the use of natural gas with provision of electric cooking and so forth, and heating, heat pumps and so forth. Of course, this should be subsidized, heavily subsidized, especially for working class and low income communities. So it connects the economic and social justice challenges with the climate justice. And just to one other initiative is to get free public transit, free public transportation. And instead of promoting what's in Build Back Better, promoting hundreds of millions of electric cars, which will clog all of the highways and so forth, and instead promote public transit that is electrified and powered by renewable energy. So those are two concrete things that I think folks could collectively get engaged in, because it'll take a political movement to make that possible.
Mike, you have anything you want to add?
I'm trying to keep up with the chat here, and I see some things that could use some answers. Well, one person is privately asking me to discuss regenerative agriculture in relation to CO2 emissions and climate change, no-till farming, plant-based diet. I'm not going to belabor those points, but I know Rodale Institute once published something that was showing, I don't remember the numbers anymore, but some tremendous amount of reductions that could be achieved by switching to regenerative organic agriculture. And I think the more that we localize food systems, make them like permaculture or regenerative, so we're sequestering carbon, but also keeping our soils healthy with compost as well, making sure it's plant-based, so we're not wasting all the land and soil and chemicals and water on animal production that is unnecessary. Just a combination of all those things will get us where we need in a very significant sector. But then there's also, there was a question about nuclear. I just dropped in a whole mess of links that I used in Facebook on social media to come back against people who are promoting nuclear power. So just copy the chat and you'll have all of those, but I'm happy to answer more direct questions on that. And then one other thing I want to address I see in here is someone on Facebook was asking why I would promote one market-based solution, which is to stop the subsidies to dirty energy, while not supporting another like a carbon tax. And so let me be really pointed about that. If you have a spectrum of dirty energy technologies, including fossil fuels, nuclear, biomass, waste incineration, landfill gas burning, et cetera, and you have subsidies going to them directly, you clearly need to stop those subsidies if you want the clean solutions to be able to compete economically. Now, a carbon tax is not the way to do it, because if you're taking, you have like, I don't know, say you have 10 different ways of making dirty energy and you're going to punish 3 of them. Well, what are you doing to the other ones? You're putting them at competitive advantage. You're making the clean energy sources have to compete with the other 7 dirty energy sources, and that doesn't get you there. And when you have something as such a blunt instrument as a carbon tax, which we don't have the politics to get the right kind of price that's even going to be meaningful in a meaningful time frame anyway, we need laws that are specific enough to say we're going to go here to this place within this specified time frame, and not think that $1 a price is going to somehow cause the transportation bill, the farm bill, all these other bills that are putting subsidies in specific directions to just move them in the right direction. We need to be less blunt and more precise about what policies we want and say we're going to go exactly here and we're going to do it in a time frame, and not think that the invisible hand of the marketplace, or some call it the invisible fist, is somehow going to know to hit the right things at the right time.
Right. I will say one other thing. As I said, we're not having a debate on carbon tax tonight. That'll be the next seminar. But I think the Greens certainly join into the concept that tinkering with the market is not the solution to climate change, and that it's been the capitalist system that has driven climate change. And if we think that we're going to solve climate change by increasing the amount of profits that hedge funds make by building offshore wind, that's not going to happen. And, that's why we say, we're the first ones out with the Green New Deal back in 2010 in New York. And that was the idea, a 10-year, and that was in 2010, mind you, a 10-year rapid transition to zero emissions combined with an economic Bill of Rights, because we need to be creating a world where everybody's going to benefit. And so people are not going to feel left behind, by the green energy transition. Nuclear power is also another one we could spend another whole seminar on. I will note I started working against nuclear power in 1973. And in fact, ran a national campaign in the presidential campaigns in 1980 to get the Democrats and Republicans to halt nuclear power and move to solar and wind. For some reason, 42 years later, we're still having that same particular fight. And one reason I initially said to stop nuclear power, 42 years not later, only is it environmentally unsafe and all the waste disposal issues, it is incredibly expensive expensive. And one of the things that nuclear power, especially new nuclear power plants, are not carbon free. They have actually a fairly significant carbon footprint over their life cycle. But it takes so long to build these nuclear power plants. They're not going to be coming online, anytime to be able to deal with the issue of climate change. You guys see any other questions in the chat?
Well, Mark, I'm very pro-nuclear, by the way. I like to shock people by saying that. We have a fantastic nuclear reactor 93 million miles away. It's a fusion reactor in the core of the sun. Not only don't we need fission power for the many reasons you just put out, but we don't need to invest billions of dollars in replicating fusion power on the surface of the Earth. Okay? Again, it has the same challenge that you just outlined for fission power. I just want to briefly comment on what's already been said on fossil fuel subsidies. I think the IMF just put out a recent report. It's even closer to $6 trillion a year, global fossil fuel subsidies. And a lot of this is indirect subsidy. The negative impacts from air pollution on health, the externalization of the impact of fossil fuel. And we know that solar is photovoltaics. It's already cheaper than the alternatives already. But the challenge is to harness the resources to invest in a more accelerated transition to renewable energy. And that's where we not only taking the $2 trillion a year of military expenditures and why we need demilitarization globally in order to meet the 1.5 degree warming target. I think it's virtually impossible that we'll be able to achieve that target without demilitarization of the global economy. And that's all wrapped up in an eco-socialist Green New Deal. And finally, regenerative agriculture, as I said in my presentation, agroecologies, regenerative agriculture, all very important for their own virtues. But again, there have been exaggerations of how much carbon sink they're capable of, particularly because of the additional warming between what we have now and 1.5 degree. And that's why once we have the sufficient renewable energy capacity globally, we then could have the ability for direct air capture and bringing down the CO2 level, which is now, we got to bring it down to below 350 parts per million. So that's going to be a challenge that not only by 2050, but it'll continue for many, many years in the future. So that's my last comment. I think we're running out of time.
We are running out of time. People ask for a couple of concrete things. I was somewhat involved recently in creating a municipal sustainability roadmap. You can just Google that. I'll eventually post it on our Facebook page for the EcoAction. It was developed in Bethlehem, New York, and it basically took 70 different things that a municipality can do to decarbonize its buildings, to promote better mass transit, to do anti-sprawl measures. And it not only pulled all the policies together in a handy document, but also then provide links to actual communities that are doing it. So you have real life models. And I will say it's not 100% great, but in Ithaca, New York, which I live in New York, they've done a fair amount on a Green New Deal, and they just authorized a $100 million project to decarbonize all the buildings in Ithaca, not just the publicly owned buildings, but all the buildings. And I noticed the new mayor of Boston is saying she's going to be doing a Green New Deal. But the other thing I'm supposed to mention is that one of the things the EcoAction Committee and the Green Party helped sponsors is the Earth Day to May Day organizing activities. This was started 6-7 years ago. A lot of different groups have been involved over time. But it's to try to demonstrate, we need to have linkages between the movements to deal with climate and the movements to deal with racial justice and economic justice and, end of discrimination. And so, it starts on Earth Day with the climate focus, and it goes to May Day in order to do the focus on immigrant rights and workers' rights. And this is something we did last year, maybe had 15, 20 events around the country. We'd like to see if we can get it up to 50 to 75 events this year. We are about out of time. EcoAction does have a webpage, facebook.com/GP EcoAction. Michael and David, Mike, do you guys want to do last 2 minutes or something?
Go ahead, Dan.
Writing in the chat. Okay. Well, when I was writing in the chat, there was a question about climate justice. I think that's a central challenge. And climate justice means not breaching the 1.5 degree limit, centigrade limit, warming limit. It means terminating energy poverty, which afflicts most of humanity. Living in the global south, they have life expectancies less than what is possible. And every child born on this planet deserves the highest quality of life that's available. And that we need enough energy to make that possible. And it's only going to be possible with a 100% transition to wind and solar power. So that's my final remark.
Great. I'm going to try to drop more in the chat before we end here, so everyone can get a copy. But yes, I saw the question on climate justice as well, and it's important to just recognize that racial injustice is baked into the system that we have in the US and globally. And you can't address any issue without addressing that. And the answer to environmental racism is not environmental equity. It's not poison people equally. It's not pick up the incinerators and the coal plants and replant them into wealthy white suburbs and hope that pollution doesn't still reach people in unequal ways, which it will and does. So the answer is, and you'll find these in the 1917 principles of environmental justice that were written up in 1991 at the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in DC. You won't find anything in there that says, spread the damage around better and we're cool with it. It's just not in there. You will find much more radical statements that are in line with the Green Party values that say we're going to end toxic, unnecessary, noxious industries anywhere. And that's the only way to achieve environmental justice is you fix the problem for everyone. And when you do that, the benefits are disproportionately going to impact those who are most disproportionately impacted right now. So that is the best way to get environmental justice, but we need to have attention to it, and not just in terms of, yay, we're going to have this Build Back Better plan or whatever plan that's going to divert all this money and invest it in communities of color that need it. Yes, that should happen. But let's not do it when we're supporting policies that are throwing billions of dollars at nuclear power and other false solutions at the same time, which have their own environmental racism impacts. We need to look at both sides of this equation and make sure the technologies and policies that we're subsidizing are not causing damage or perpetuating unequal damage on the ground.
So we are out of time. Somebody pointed out that municipal sustainable roadmap's not yet on the Facebook page because this webinar's not over with. I'll have it up later. But one of the things we will do, I assume with my assistance of David and Michael, and I want to thank them for this participation, is that we will compile a lot of the things that have been posted in the chat, and we will put that in an email that is sent to everybody who is pre-registered for this event. So you have all the links and the connections and stuff like that. On a personal note, I noticed that at least one person had posted a question related, how do we get rid of single-use plastics? Or is that something the Greens support? Happens to be my wife runs a group that does that. It's called beyondplastics.org. You can go check it out. I will say Green Party of Brooklyn, I used to live in Brooklyn, we were actually the first group in New York City to hold a big public meeting to ban the plastic bags. And after a long, convoluted journey, we managed to do that in New York State. Just today in New York City, a follow-up to that called Skip the Stop, basically to stop restaurants and delivery places from handing you plastic utensils when you buy food, was supposed to be passed. It was supported by the restaurant industry. We've been talking about this for years. And our good mayor, de Blasio, once again killed the bill literally at the last hour. And so now we have to go start all over again with the new mayor and a new city council. And then one final thing, many people support the concept of extended producer responsibility. Those who produce waste should be responsible, including financially, for taking care of the waste. And there was a bill last year that was pretty much packaged by the packaging industry that actually a lot of environmental groups supported because it had a nice phrase, extended producer responsibility, but it gave too much power to the industry. So just today, a group of people have been working for the last 5 months, 6 months, to come up with a model extended producer responsibility bill. And we will put a link to that in the follow-up that we do to that. You can send me dunleymark@aol.com. I think it's, we'll send you the link. There's an email you can send to EcoAction. We are going to try to start state chapters of EcoAction. We will do more of these webinars. Maybe the next webinar will be on the carbon tax, and then maybe the one on nuclear, though I think it's very clear the Green Party is totally against nuclear power, other than the nuclear power of the sun. And one final word I would say, you've been hearing a lot in the media recently, we're almost there with nuclear fusion, and nuclear fusion doesn't produce any, waste and stuff like that. And I just read an article today, these same companies that have been the new startup groups have been the new startup groups for about 20, 30 years. And they never actually solve any of the problems. They have shown an amazing capacity to raise billions of dollars in private investment for what they're doing. What they have failed to show is they can actually solve the myriad of the technical problems involved in operating the sun within our own, commercial system. Eco-Socialist Green New Deal. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, David. We will post stuff to everybody. Thank you, Michael O'Neill, our communications director. Have a good evening and happy holidays.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.